Melania Trump gazed out the window of the luxurious penthouse suite overlooking Manhattan's skyline. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, but her mind was miles away. It wasn't the bright lights or the glittering world of the elite that occupied her thoughts, but the man sitting across from her, Donald Trump, her husband. The weight of their marriage had never been more apparent. On the surface, it was the picture of power and privilege. The First Lady of the United States, a perfect complement to the ever-controversial Donald. But beneath the polished exterior, something was stirring, a slow burn of resentment, frustration, and desire for control. The years had worn them down in ways no one could see. Melania's once perfect smile had become a mask, hiding the battle between duty and desire. She had been his wife for over 2 decades, yet the man who sat before her seemed like a stranger, his eyes devoid of the affection that had once drawn her to him. Power, wealth, and status had become their currency. Everything else, including their marriage, was secondary. Donald leaned back in his chair, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. It was a look she knew all too well. He was thinking, plotting, and she was just another piece in his grand design. "Melania," Donald's voice broke through her reverie. "We have to stay focused. The election is just around the corner, and everything we've worked for is on the line." She turned to him, her gaze cold but steady. "Everything we've worked for? Or everything you've worked for, Donald?" Her words cut through the air, sharper than she intended. He wasn't just a politician or a businessman. He was her husband, and right now, that title felt almost secondary. Donald raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You always had a way with words, Melania. But you know how it is. We're in this together, whether you like it or not." She felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she suppressed it, the years of practice in maintaining her composure kicking in. "I don't need to be part of your political games," she replied, her voice icy. "I didn't sign up for this. I signed up to be your wife." He stood, pacing across the room. "And you will be, but not in the way you think. This isn't just about us, Melania. This is about the future of our country. And whether you like it or not, you are the face of this administration now." The words stung. She had once believed in the dream of power and influence, but now she saw it for what it truly was: chains. Donald had his vision, and she was a pawn in it, just as she had always been. The realization settled heavily in her chest, like a stone sinking into the depths of the ocean. "You're not listening, Donald," she said quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken truths. "You never listen, and maybe that's why we're so far apart now." He stopped in his tracks, his back to her. For a moment, the silence between them was deafening. Then, without turning around, he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You're right. I don't listen, but I don't need to. I'm Donald Trump, and I always get what I want." Melania's breath caught in her throat. She had heard those words before, but this time they carried a different weight. The walls she had built around herself were beginning to crumble, and for the first time in years, she wondered if she could ever escape from the gilded cage she had been trapped in. The tension between them thickened, the air charged with an electricity that neither of them could deny. Melania stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She was done being a bystander in her own life. Something inside her snapped, and she made a decision. This marriage, this life, was no longer enough. If she was to play this game, she would play it on her own terms. "Then I guess we both know what's next," she said, her voice cool but firm. Donald turned to face her, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You're not going anywhere, Melania. You're in this as much as I am." But as Melania stared into his eyes, she knew something he didn't. This was no longer just about power or politics. It was about control, and she was going to take back what was hers. The nights in the penthouse suite were growing colder. The heat from the city below did little to touch the chill that had settled between Melania and Donald. The silence between them had become a constant companion, one that neither of them seemed willing to break, though both knew the fragile thread that held them together was slowly unraveling. Melania's mind had become a storm of conflicting emotions: resentment, fear, and a strange, quiet determination. She had stayed silent for years, a spectator to the world that Donald had built. But now, the mask of the perfect First Lady, the ever-smiling, ever-supportive wife, was beginning to crack. It had been a week since the conversation in the penthouse. The words they exchanged had been heavy with meaning, yet nothing had been said outright. They both knew where they stood. Donald, as always, was wrapped up in his own world of politics and power, while Melania was left to navigate the quiet wreckage of their marriage. Melania sat alone in the spacious, almost sterile sitting room, her fingers gently tracing the rim of a glass of wine. She could feel the weight of her loneliness pressing against her chest. Her life was a gilded cage. It had been from the moment she had stepped into the world of Donald Trump. She had known the price of admission: glamour, wealth, influence, the best of everything. But now she wondered if the cost had been too high. The years of dutifully standing by his side, the years of silencing her own voice in favor of his ambitions, had worn her down in ways she hadn't fully realized until now. The sound of a door opening broke her thoughts, and she turned to see Donald enter the room. His presence filled the space, commanding attention, even when he said nothing. He was still the same, larger than life, self-assured, the man who had built an empire and become the President of the United States. But behind his eyes was something different, something colder, something more calculated. He had always been a man driven by a thirst for power, but now it felt like something darker had taken root within him. Melania met his gaze as he walked toward her, her expression unreadable. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. "You're still awake," Donald said, his voice a mix of exhaustion and something else, something almost predatory. "You should be resting. You've been working hard." Melania didn't respond immediately. She studied him for a long moment, feeling a strange sense of detachment. He hadn't even noticed how much had changed. How could he? He had never truly seen her for who she was. Not really. "I don't need rest," she finally replied, her voice cold and steady. "What I need is something more than this." She gestured around the room, as though the opulence of their surroundings was a symbol of the emptiness she felt inside. Donald stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. There was a shift in the air, a subtle tension that suddenly filled the space between them. "More than what?" he asked, his voice clipped. "What do you want, Melania? You have everything you could ever need." Her heart twisted at the words. Everything. Yes, she had everything that money could buy: clothes, cars, jewels, the finest food, the most luxurious vacations. But the one thing that money couldn't buy was something she had been craving for years: freedom. Freedom from the man who controlled her every move, her every word. The power he wielded over her was suffocating, and she was starting to realize that she no longer wanted to be just another part of his empire. "I want respect," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. "I want to be seen, not just as your wife, not just as a trophy. I want to be heard." Donald's face hardened at the words, his jaw tightening. He had never been one to accept any form of defiance, especially from her. Melania had always been the perfect picture of grace, of loyalty, until now. Respect? His voice dripped with incredulity. "You have my respect. You have everything you need. What more could you possibly want?" Melania's lips pressed into a thin line, her patience wearing thin. She stood up, her posture straight, and for the first time in years, she felt a surge of power flowing through her veins. She wasn't the passive, obedient wife she had once been. She was something else now. Someone who had learned the cost of staying silent. Someone who understood what she was willing to sacrifice to take control of her own destiny. "You think you've given me everything," she said, her eyes flashing with a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface for years. But you haven't. You've given me your money, your name, your title, but not your respect, not your love. You think this," she waved her hand around the room, "is enough. But it's not, Ty." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Donald stood there, his face unreadable, the weight of her words sinking in. But just as quickly as the moment had passed, he broke the silence, his tone now colder than ever. "You're being selfish, Melania," he snapped, stepping closer to her. "Everything I do is for us, for our family. And you're sitting here whining about respect? You should be grateful for what you have. If you think you can walk away from all of this, you're wrong." The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, she felt the familiar sting of his manipulation. But this time, it was different. This time, she wouldn't back down. "Maybe I don't need all of this," she said, her voice now tinged with something dangerous. "Maybe I need something more, something that's mine, something real." Donald's eyes darkened, the fury building behind them. He stepped forward again, his breath heavy, his chest rising and falling with the weight of his anger. But Melania didn't flinch. "You think you can leave me?" he growled, his voice a low, threatening rumble. "You think you can walk away from everything we've built? You'll never be free, Melania, not while I'm alive." The words sent a chill down her spine, but she stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated any longer. "Maybe I don't need to be free," she whispered, her voice a deadly calm. "Maybe I just need to take back control, and you're not going to stop me." The days that followed were a blur of tension and calculated silence. The White House, once a place of authority and grandeur, now felt like a battleground, its halls echoing with the heavy footsteps of two people who were no longer on the same side. Melania could feel the weight of Donald's presence lingering in every room, like a shadow that followed her wherever she went. But now, there was something different in the air, something palpable, an undeniable shift that neither of them could ignore. She had stayed quiet for so long, but now, the silence felt suffocating. The cost of living in the gilded cage of their marriage was becoming too high, and Melania could no longer ignore the rising tide of resentment that simmered beneath the surface. She had played the perfect wife, the adoring first lady for years, but now it felt like the mask she had so carefully constructed was slipping. The years of living in the shadow of Donald's ambition, of being nothing more than a symbol of his power, had taken their toll. Donald, too, had begun to change. His power had grown, as had his arrogance, but beneath that confidence, something darker was taking hold. He had always been a man of control, but now, with every passing day, he seemed more desperate to maintain that control over everything, including Melania. Melania stood by the window in the private study, looking out at the expanse of the White House grounds. The world outside was peaceful, serene almost, a stark contrast to the storm that raged within her. She could see the Secret Service agents moving about, their eyes scanning every corner of the estate. They were his eyes, his hands. She had never felt more trapped. A soft knock on the door broke her thoughts. She didn't need to ask who it was. "Come in," she said, her voice cool but steady. Donald entered without a word, his imposing figure filling the doorway. His presence was always overwhelming, like the calm before a storm. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing in the silence that hung between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension was thick, palpable, almost suffocating. Melania turned to face him, her eyes cold and unblinking. She wasn't going to back down this time. The war had already started, and there was no turning back. "I need to speak with you," Donald said, his voice laced with a mix of frustration and something darker, something that hinted at the depth of the control he still wanted over her. Melania didn't respond immediately. She had learned long ago that silence was the only way to hold her ground with him. The more she stayed quiet, the more he was forced to reveal. "I don't understand you," Donald continued, his tone sharpening. "I've given you everything, everything you've ever wanted. You've had a front row seat to history, Melania. You're the First Lady, the most powerful woman in the world. And yet, You're still not satisfied. You're still unhappy." Melania's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. The words burned in her chest, but she knew they weren't just for Donald. They were for herself, too. She had to say them, even if they cost her everything. "You don't get it," she said, her voice low but resolute. "You've never understood me. Not really." Donald's brow furrowed, confusion and anger flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean? What is it that you want, Melania? What else is there?" Melania stepped closer to him, the space between them closing with every step. She was tired of playing the role of the obedient wife, tired of waiting for him to see her as more than just a pretty face by his side. She was tired of living in his shadow. "I want my own life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but full of power. "I want to be more than just the woman who stands next to you. I want to be seen for who I am, not just as the First Lady, not just as the wife of Donald Trump. I want to be free." The words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. Donald's expression darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, Melania saw a flicker of something almost human in his eyes, something vulnerable, something scared. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold, calculating man she had married. "You think you can just walk away?" he asked, his voice a growl. "You think you can leave everything behind? The money, the power, the position? Do you really believe that's what you want?" Melania's heart raced, but she stood her ground, her eyes locking with his. "I don't need your money, Donald. I don't need your power. I never did. I need something real, something of my own." Donald's face twisted in anger, his eyes blazing. "You're nothing without me. You're nothing without this. You think you can go out there and be something? You'll be nothing but a footnote, a joke." Melania felt the sting of his words, but they no longer had the power to break her. She had spent too many years under his thumb, too many years bending to his will. No more. "You're wrong," she said, her voice firm and steady. "I don't need you, not anymore. And I'm not going to let you keep me trapped in this prison of your making." With those words, the dam broke. The years of resentment, of silence, of waiting for something to change, it all came flooding out. She was done. Done with being the dutiful wife. Done with living in the shadow of Donald's power. She was going to take her life back, no matter the cost. Donald took a step toward her, his face twisted in rage. "You think you can leave me? You think you can just walk away from everything I've given you? You'll never be free, Melania. Not while I'm alive." Melania met his gaze, her eyes burning with a fire she hadn't felt in years. "Maybe not, but I'll be free in here," she said, tapping her chest. "And that's all that matters." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't afraid of losing everything. What she had gained in the process, the strength to leave, the courage to be herself, that was worth more than anything Donald had ever offered her. As she stepped into the hallway, she heard him call out to her, but she didn't turn back. She had already made her decision. The war was over, and she had won.